The relentless fog of Astoria, Oregon, was not the soft, ethereal veil of a fairy tale. It was a damp, biting presence, thick with the smell of brine and diesel, clinging to the soul like a bad memory. It was against this backdrop that Anya Sterling, all of 24 years, stood with her worn suitcase and a heart that felt perpetually bruised. She was a woman running not from the law, but from the crushing weight of utter, bewildering financial failure. Back in the unforgiving farmlands of the Midwest, the bank had taken the last of her family's legacy, leaving her with an echo of her father's desperate last words and the sudden, terrifying realization that she was utterly alone. She had sold everything she owned that wasn't essential, which tragically included most of her self-worth, and bought a one-way ticket toward the only direction that felt like freedom, the vast, indifferent Pacific Ocean. Astoria was not a place of warm welcomes. It was a town built on timber and tenacity, a place where people measured worth by the salt under their fingernails and the tonnage in their nets. Anya, with her pale skin, city-soft hands, and the residual tremor of anxiety that made her fingers twitch near ledgers, felt like an interloper. She didn't look like a fisherwoman, she looked like a fragile thing the next squall would tear away. And yet the harbor held a strange, magnetic pull. It represented the ultimate reset, a place so far removed from wheat fields and interest rates that the past felt like another lifetime's bad dream. She had to build something here, anything, or risk collapsing entirely. This was her last stand. Her only asset, the anchor for this fragile new life, was the ramshackle fish shack she had purchased sight unseen, a transaction so cheap it practically screamed trouble. She had found the listing buried deep in the classifieds. Historic waterfront structure. Needs total restoration. Buyer assumes all liabilities. The price was less than the security deposit on a decent apartment. It was located on the extreme western edge of the pier, a stretch largely abandoned since the major processing plant moved inland a decade prior. Anya finally reached it after a long walk past working docks where grizzled men in orange oilskins watched her with indifferent, assessing eyes. The sight of the shack was immediately, crushingly disappointing. It was not quaint, it was a ruin. The place listed sharply to the left, as if leaning into the Pacific wind for support. The roof was a patchwork of moss and peeling asphalt shingles. The cedar siding was silvered and rotten in streaks, and the whole structure groaned beneath the relentless pressure of the elements. A chain-link fence, rusted to the color of dried blood, sagged around the perimeter, offering no real barrier, only a symbolic exclusion. The address, crudely painted on a plank nailed crookedly above the door, read, Pier 73, the Blackwood Lot. Unlocking the padlock, a monumental rusted thing that took all her effort to turn, was like opening a tomb. The air inside was dense, cold, and utterly stagnant, a chemical cocktail of mildew, dried fish scales, and something deeper, more mineral, like wet concrete and long-dead aspirations. Light struggled to penetrate the single grime-coated window, but what little did enter revealed a room filled with shadows and chaos. The main space was small, maybe 15 feet by 20, with a rickety workbench dominating one side and a precarious, dust-caked cot on the other. Water damage had created black, weeping streaks down the interior wall. Anya dropped her suitcase with a dull thud that echoed ominously in the silence. For a brief, terrifying moment, the crushing despair of the past few months threatened to consume her. This is it. This is how far I've fallen. She sank onto the workbench, the wood rough beneath her fingertips, and fought the urge to cry, knowing that if she started she might never stop. Vulnerability was a luxury she couldn't afford. She took a deep, shuddering breath, filling her lungs with the toxic air. "Oh, I will not break here. I will build." Her first task was elemental. Clear the detritus and let the sea air breathe life back into the space. She started with the workbench. Beneath a thick layer of dust and dried netting, she found something solid, rectangular, and strangely smooth. It was a small, lead-weighted compass, the brass housing tarnished green with verdigris. It wasn't a standard maritime compass, but a specialized bearing compass, heavy and beautifully crafted. The glass face, though scratched, was intact, and the needle, impossibly, still pointed true north despite years of neglect and the magnetic pull of the coast. She wiped the dust away with her sleeve. Engraved delicately on the base beneath the glass were 3 initials, OB. Anya felt a tiny, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere. The shack was not just abandoned. It had been inhabited. And the man who left this behind had cared deeply for precision and navigation. She placed the compass carefully in her pocket, a small, cold weight of responsibility. She picked up a heavy, salt-encrusted plastic tarp draped over a far corner. It smelled intensely of dead seaweed. Tugging it free, she revealed the wall beneath. The interior siding, unlike the rest of the room, was surprisingly solid, constructed not of cheap paneling, but of thick, interlocking wood planks meticulously sealed. It was an anomaly in the decay. She ran her hand over the smooth wood. The planks were scarred, yes, but not rotten. Then her fingers brushed against something metallic. It wasn't a nail, but a small, recessed brass fixture, almost invisible in the gloom. It looked like the kind of latch used on a hidden cabinet or a ship's locker. Curiosity, a far more effective antidote to despair than any amount of courage, took hold. She pressed the fixture. Nothing happened. She pressed harder and a faint click echoed. The central plank, nearly 2 feet wide, didn't swing out, but slid upward a fraction of an inch before sticking. Anya used the blunt edge of a small crowbar she had brought. With a groan of old wood against wood, she leveraged the plank. It rose slowly, gratingly, revealing a narrow, dark space behind the wall. The air that escaped was different, dry, still, and carrying the faint, sweet scent of cedar and old paper. The space wasn't large, but it was deep, obviously intended as a secret compartment, sealed against the perpetual damp of the Oregon coast. Inside, nestled on a bed of heavy canvas, protected from time and tide, sat a leather-bound book and a rolled cylinder of heavy paper, tied with fraying twine. The despair was gone, replaced by a sudden, exhilarating spike of pure, unadulterated tension. This wasn't just a shed, it was a vault. This wasn't just a fixer-upper. It was the prologue to someone else's unfinished story. The names and the history of Astoria were about to claim the fragile heart of Anya Sterling. The compass in her pocket grew colder, heavier. She was no longer just running. She had stumbled into a past that refused to be buried by the tide. This shack belonged to someone with secrets, and she had just unlocked the first one. The discovery of the hidden cache, the leather-bound book and the tightly rolled scroll, was the kind of sharp, adrenaline-fueled shock that instantly resets the mind, pulling Anya Sterling violently out of her self-pity. The smell of cedar and ancient paper was a welcome change from the pervasive stench of mildew and decay that dominated Pier 73. She realized with a sudden clarity-inducing jolt that this shack was not merely abandoned. It had been preserved. The meticulous effort to secure this hidden space, to protect its contents from the hungry dampness of the Oregon coast, spoke volumes about the owner's mindset. It suggested not carelessness, but a deliberate final act of concealment. She lifted the book first. It was a captain's log, not bound in the standard military-issue canvas, but in thick, dark leather, aged soft by years of handling and the friction of sea-worn hands. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the handwriting was strikingly uniform and precise. A small, disciplined cursive that moved across the page with an almost architectural symmetry. On the very first page, inscribed with a fountain pen, were the words, Owen Blackwood, Navigator, Astoria. The confirmation was immediate and chilling. She was holding the physical memory of the captain who had vanished 15 years ago, a man who had become a ghost story whispered in the low, gravelly tones of Astoria's fishing community. Anya placed the logbook gently aside, her heart hammering a rhythm against her ribs that was louder than the distant groan of the docks. Her hands, still trembling from the effort of prying open the secret panel, reached for the rolled scroll. It was heavier than she anticipated, a thick, expensive parchment, and as she carefully untied the fraying twine, the paper resisted, stiff from the years. When she finally managed to smooth it flat on the dusty workbench, the sheer, unexpected brilliance of the drawing took her breath away. It wasn't a map of the sea. It was a celestial map, a stunning hand-drawn diagram of the night sky over the northern Pacific. Yet it wasn't a standard astronomical chart. Certain constellations were heavily circled in black ink. Others were connected by complex lines that looked less like the natural flow of stars and more like a geometric calculation. At the bottom, a series of precise latitude and longitude coordinates were listed next to strange archaic symbols that looked almost alchemical. This was not the practical tool of a fisherman. This was the work of a scholar, a dreamer, a man consumed by the heavens as much as the tides. Owen Blackwood, the legendary captain, was clearly a man of complexity, and this cabana, this humble rotting shack, was his laboratory. The physical act of restoration suddenly gained a different, almost reverent purpose. It was no longer about her fragile attempt at a new life. It was about honoring and understanding the memory of a man she had never met. The vulnerability that usually held her captive, the fear of failure and the weight of her past debt, momentarily receded, replaced by the thrilling, dangerous pull of curiosity. She needed to know why Owen Blackwood, a man lost at sea, had left the most crucial parts of his life locked away behind a false wall, in a place that the town had deemed worthless and forgotten. Anya spent the next 3 days in a feverish, almost trance-like state. She didn't just clear the debris, she excavated the truth. Using a cheap scraper, she meticulously removed the blackened, water-damaged drywall from the rest of the interior. Beneath the rotten facade, she discovered more than just the shack's bones. She found its personality. Every plank, every nail seemed to have been placed with a carpenter's skill and a captain's pragmatism. The windows, though caked in salt, were triple-paned, designed to withstand the brutal winter storms of the Oregon coast. The single fireplace, hidden by a stack of discarded netting, was not the cheap metal stove common to these shacks, but a small, expertly constructed stone hearth that drew air perfectly, even after years of disuse. She discovered small, practical details that painted a picture of Captain Blackwood's routines. A carved indentation in the workbench, perfectly sized to hold the small bearing compass she had found. A series of cleverly constructed shelves concealed beneath the floorboards near the cot, used to store dried provisions and scientific instruments, not fishing gear. Owen Blackwood hadn't just used this shack, he had fortified it. He had treated it not as a transient shelter, but as a long-term, secret base of operations. The most poignant discovery came late one evening, as the fog outside thickened and the air inside the newly scrubbed space grew cold. She was sweeping the dusty floorboards near the front door when her broom snagged on a loose knot in the wood. Pushing the knot with her finger, she felt the floor shift slightly. She knelt, using the crowbar again with more precision this time, and gently lifted a small, square panel. Beneath it was a shallow depression lined with velvet. A makeshift time capsule. Inside, resting on the faded cloth, were 3 objects that hit her with the full emotional force of the captain's disappearance. A photograph, slightly blurred at the edges, of a young girl with fiery red hair and eyes the exact color of the turbulent ocean, smiling fiercely, holding a hand-drawn picture of a massive fishing boat. On the back, in Owen's neat cursive, Coral, age 9. My North Star. A gold wedding band, simple and worn thin, its inner surface polished smooth by years against skin. And finally, a small dried flower, a species Anya didn't recognize, pressed between 2 squares of clear, brittle glass, the color completely leached out, leaving only the delicate skeleton of its shape. These objects were anchors of a man's personal life, placed not in a hidden vault for secrets, but in a small, tender grave beneath the floorboards, a sign of deep, quiet grief or perhaps a permanent farewell. They were relics of love, marriage, and fatherhood, placed where the owner could step over them every day, a constant physical reminder of what he had left behind. Anya sat back on her heels, clutching the velvet-lined box. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound, almost intimate connection to the man who had occupied this space. She wasn't an intruder anymore. She was the custodian of his memory, the only living person to witness the private, final moments of his life before he vanished. Owen Blackwood wasn't just a legend now. He was a grieving father, a meticulous navigator, and a man with secrets hidden in the stars. The heavy emotional weight of the gold band and the photo pressed down on Anya, amplifying her own unspoken loneliness. This was the moment of transformation. Her vulnerability wasn't a flaw, but an antenna, allowing her to receive the signal of Owen's silent 15-year-old cry. Her own flight from failure had led her directly to the epicenter of someone else's mystery, and she knew with terrifying certainty that she could not stop until she understood why this man had seemingly walked away from his North Star and his promise. The restoration of the shack was over. The investigation had begun. Anya's self-imposed isolation at Pier 73 lasted exactly 4 days before the outside world, in the form of Astoria's relentless curiosity, decided to intrude. It was the scent of freshly cut cedar and the rhythmic thump of a hammer, sounds utterly foreign to the derelict shack, that betrayed her presence. The townspeople were accustomed to the quiet decay of the Blackwood lot. They were not accustomed to the sound of progress, particularly not from a pale-faced newcomer who looked as if she'd break if the wind shifted too quickly. Her first real encounter came in the form of Old Man Finn, a retired gillnetter and the unofficial historian of the dock, his face a map of some cracks and old grudges. He found Anya standing on a rickety ladder, scraping oxidized paint from a window frame, the logbook and celestial map safely hidden beneath the floorboards once more. Finn stood at the edge of her miserable, sagging fence, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his heavy wool jacket, the fog making his figure appear larger, more judgmental. "That's Owen's place, girl," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to carry the cold of the Columbia River. It wasn't a question but a pronouncement, a necessary delineation of territory and history. Anya flinched, the sandpaper stalling in her hand. She climbed down, steadying her breath. "Sir, I bought it. Anya Sterling." She offered a hand, but Finn merely squinted at her, his gaze sharp and dissecting. "Sterling," he repeated slowly as if testing the weight of a foreign coin. "Midwest, I hear. Not much call for corn farming out here." The implication was clear. She did not belong. "You selling fish? Mending nets?" "I'm opening a small repair shop, custom rigging. And living here," she replied, trying to project a confidence she was light years from feeling. The vulnerability of her financial situation always felt visible to her, like a scarlet letter. Finn's eyes narrowed, shifting from Anya to the freshly cleaned wood of the door frame. "Owen Blackwood built this place with his own hands. Didn't trust land carpentry. Said wood for the sea must be joined by men of the sea. It was his anchor. And his secret." He paused, letting the word secret hang in the damp air, thick and menacing. "He was a captain who chased more than just tonnage, Miss Sterling. He was chasing the edge of the map. 15 years ago the sea decided he went too far." The legend of Owen Blackwood, Anya learned quickly from Finn's reluctantly shared, fragmented stories, was a tapestry woven from tragedy and professional brilliance. He wasn't just a captain, he was the navigator. In an industry governed by instinct and radio reports, Owen was renowned for his reliance on celestial mechanics and arcane knowledge. He was a scientist who talked about deep-sea thermal vents, continental shelf topography and astronomical alignments, not just where the salmon were biting. He was often mocked, but his hauls were undeniable, always maximizing efficiency, never luck. His disappearance, however, had swallowed all that brilliance. He had sailed out on a clear August morning aboard the North Star, his namesake vessel, with a full tank of fuel and no visible cargo, telling only the dockmaster he was on a private research run. 2 weeks later, the North Star was found bobbing 20 miles off the coast of the Olympic Peninsula. Perfectly intact, the running lights still operable, the galley fully stocked. But Owen Blackwood was gone. No distress call. No signs of struggle. Just an empty boat sailing home on an indifferent current. The Coast Guard had concluded a marine accident. A slip, a rogue wave, a heart attack. But Astoria had settled on a more dramatic, persistent narrative. The sea claimed him. Owen had gotten too arrogant, ventured into coordinates known only to ancient mariners, or worse, was hunting something forbidden, something the sea defended violently. "They searched his house, his office," Finn continued, his voice dropping conspiratorially, "but never this shack. Everyone knew this was his private mind. His chart room, he called it. But after the funeral, after the Coast Guard closed the book, this place was just left. His wife moved inland. His daughter, Coral, she stayed, but she wouldn't come near the water for years. It's a haunted place, Miss Sterling. And you're stirring the dust." The conversation served as a critical reset. Anya realized she was not simply uncovering a history. She was reopening a cold case in a community that had deliberately chosen to let the wounds scar over, opting for folklore over fact. Her presence, and the renewed life she was bringing to the Blackwood lot, was a challenge to Astoria's collective closure. That night, as the foghorns cried their mournful warnings across the water, Anya retreated inside the shack. The space, though partially cleaned, felt heavier, now imbued with the tragedy and suspicion articulated by Finn. She pulled the logbook out, opening it carefully. Most entries were mundane, detailing fuel consumption and tide charts. but interspersed between the columns of figures were philosophical musings and cryptic notes. August 14th. The math holds. The alignment is confirmed. The earth only appears flat to those who refuse to look up. They see the surface, I see the celestial influence on the deep currents. If I cannot find the answer in the water, I must find it in the stars. And on the day before his disappearance, August 26th, final preparations. The coordinates from the star map are transcribed. I leave the anchor here. If the journey fails, the truth must find its way back to Coral. The risk is calculated, but the variables are human. And they are close. A chill that had nothing to do with the outside air ran down Anya's spine. The variables are human. And they are close. This was not a man preparing for an accident. This was a man executing a high-stakes, dangerous plan. He knew he might not return. The items beneath the floorboards, the ring, the photo, were his farewell. He had left his secrets not in the logbook that would be searched, but in the walls of his sanctum, betting that no one would dare profane his secret space. Anya clutched the heavy, worn leather of the logbook. The fragile young woman from the Midwest, driven by debt and fear, was slowly being replaced by someone driven by justice and a fierce protectiveness over the dead man's memory. She was now bound to the missing captain not by shared failure, but by a shared purpose. She realized she couldn't simply restore the shack. She had to finish Owen Blackwood's journey. The sea may have claimed him, but his story was still waiting to be told. The celestial map, meticulously unrolled beneath the solitary sputtering work lamp of the Blackwood lot, was not merely a drawing. It was a window into the dizzying, brilliant mind of Captain Owen Blackwood. For Anya, it was the most compelling object she had ever encountered, a stunning blend of classical cartography and scientific obsession. The heavy parchment was covered not with the familiar nautical landmarks of the Oregon coast, the Columbia Bar, Tillamook Head, or the treacherous jetties, but with the ethereal geometry of the cosmos. It was his ultimate confession. Owen Blackwood saw the sea not as a surface, but as a system governed by forces far beyond the tide table. Anya, with her background in accounting and crisis management, possessed a strong, disciplined mind, perfectly suited for recognizing patterns and anomalies. She had always dealt with the cold logic of finance. Now she was applying that same discipline to the cold logic of the stars. She began by cross-referencing the sketched constellations, Orion, Cassiopeia, and the faint, smudged outline of the Great Bear, with a cheap, spiral-bound astronomical guide she purchased from a used bookstore in downtown Astoria. She quickly realized the chart was not a snapshot of a single night, but a compilation of several specific astronomical alignments. The dates inscribed along the bottom edge of the parchment, corresponding to the heavily circled star groupings, all occurred in the same narrow window, August of the year Owen vanished 15 years prior. He was tracking an event or a series of events, tied to the predictable recurring movements of celestial bodies. It was navigation by chronometer and destiny. The deepest mystery lay in the interconnected lines. Owen had drawn complex vectors between key stars and the coordinates listed below, latitudes and longitudes that placed the marked locations far from the established shipping lanes. They were points in the vast, almost featureless expanse of the North Pacific known for nothing but deep water and unpredictable currents. The symbols next to the coordinates were what truly captured her attention. They were angular and archaic, bearing a striking resemblance to some obscure alchemical notations she'd once seen in a college textbook, symbols representing elements in their rarest, most pure forms. "The variables are human," Owen had written. Anya repeated the phrase aloud, the sound of her voice thin against the thick silence of the shack. Owen Blackwood, the meticulous navigator, was planning a journey based on a map of the heavens, yet he feared the interference of people. This implied his quest was not simply intellectual. It was proprietary and potentially illegal or dangerous enough to attract adversaries. Her focused, near-obsessive study was punctuated by the rhythmic, unnerving scrutiny of the pier. Old Man Finn's subtle surveillance was one thing, but 2 nights later, a new element of fear injected itself into the lonely sanctuary of Pier 73. Anya had been working late, the only light spilling from the shack casting a sickly yellow rectangle onto the dark, wet planks of the pier. Lost in the map's complex geometry, she barely registered the sound of a heavy diesel engine idling nearby, not a fishing boat but a large, powerful truck. The engine cut out abruptly, and a moment later the sharp metallic ping of boots on the dock planks broke the fog-laden silence. She froze, her heart instantly migrating to her throat. She instinctively extinguished the lamp, plunging the shack into a darkness so absolute she couldn't see her own hands. She heard the footsteps approach, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside the shack. "Anyone home?" A voice, deep and devoid of inflection, called out. It wasn't hostile, but the lack of urgency made it chilling, the tone of someone merely checking an expected vacant lot. Anya pressed her back against the cool, damp wall, the hidden compartment holding the truth only inches away from her shoulder. She held her breath, willing her trembling to stop, tasting the metallic tang of fear on her tongue. The silence stretched, a taut wire of pure dread. Then a sound that made her skin crawl. A hand rested on the door frame, a slow, deliberate scrape of heavy leather against the old wood. The person was listening. They knew someone was inside, or at least they were testing for a presence. "Just seeing if the old Blackwood place was still empty," the voice murmured, low enough that it barely reached her. "It'd be a shame if someone came in and disturbed the peace. Some things are best left buried, wouldn't you say?" The message was unambiguous. It wasn't a question of trespass. It was a threat disguised as a neighborly check. This person knew the history, knew the nature of the shack, and knew that its peace had just been disturbed by the arrival of an outsider. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, the footsteps retreated, the metallic pinging of boots fading away before the truck engine roared back to life, its tires crunching on the gravel road leading away from the pier. Anya remained in the cold darkness for another 15 minutes, her body rigid, until she was sure the threat was truly gone. When she finally flicked the lamp back on, the harsh light felt like a blessing. She stared at the celestial map, now viewing the intricate lines not as scientific curiosity, but as a potential death warrant. Owen Blackwood's human variables were not theoretical. They were real, they were active, and they were watching her. This encounter served as a brutal, visceral reset for Anya. Her fragility, her initial desire for a quiet life of mending nets, shattered completely. She was no longer a victim seeking refuge. She was an accidental participant in a 15-year-old conflict. The secrets she held, the logbook, the map, the coordinates, were incredibly valuable to someone, and that person had just let her know the stakes were lethal. She carefully rolled the star map and slipped it back into the compartment, double-checking the latch. Her hands were steady now, driven not by fear but by a cold, protective rage. She looked at the compass, OB, sitting on the workbench. "You left this for your daughter, Captain. I won't let your truth be buried by your enemies." The act of confronting real, immediate danger paradoxically solidified her sense of self and purpose. Her vulnerability, initially a sign of weakness, had been forged into a quiet, burning resolve. She had survived the financial collapse of her past, and she would survive this conspiracy. She was bound to Owen Blackwood by a shared understanding of what it meant to fight for a lost legacy. To proceed, however, she needed information, and there was only one place to get the official story: the Coast Guard, and only one person who truly held the emotional key to Owen Blackwood: his daughter. The shadow that had visited the Blackwood lot 2 nights prior was the grim catalyst Anya needed. The low, menacing voice and the knowledge that someone was protecting Owen Blackwood's silence solidified her purpose. She had to move the investigation from the secret walls of the shack to the public record of Astoria. It was a risky move, exposing her vulnerability to official skepticism and community hostility, but the celestial map demanded context that only the past could provide. Her first stop was the U.S. Coast Guard Station Astoria, a modern, imposing structure of steel and glass, a stark contrast to the weathered wood of the docks. She approached the duty officer, a massive, unyielding man named Chief Petty Officer Callahan, a person whose demeanor suggested he dealt with drama and delusion on a daily basis. Anya presented her query carefully, choosing her words to sound like a respectful history enthusiast, not a paranoid investigator. She inquired about the official file on the disappearance of Captain Owen Blackwood 15 years prior, and the finding of his vessel, the North Star. Callahan, sitting behind a perpetually tidy desk, barely looked up from his paperwork. "Blackwood," he repeated, the name flat and tired. "Case file 457. Status, closed. Findings, marine accident. Body unrecovered." Anya pressed, her nervousness translating into an overly formal tone. I understand, Chief, but I've recently acquired the old Blackwood property, Pier 73, and I'm curious about the specific details of the North Star when it was recovered. Any logs, any unusual equipment? Callahan finally looked up, his eyes a cold, skeptical blue. He sized her up, the young woman with the expensive but worn jacket, the obvious tremor in her hands, and the clear lack of genuine sea experience. Miss Sterling, he stated, his voice a low, dismissive rumble. The North Star was found fully seaworthy. No collision, no hull breach, no fire. Galley lights on, radio functioning. The fishing gear was secured. Everything pointed to the captain simply falling overboard, possibly due to a sudden medical event. We logged every item. No celestial maps, no coded journals, nothing of interest other than standard equipment. It was a clean, tragic accident. And it was 15 years ago. The clarity of his rejection was a stark validation of Owen's caution. The captain hadn't been careless. He had been paranoid and brilliant. He knew the authorities would find the North Star, and he ensured that anything pointing to his true mission was secured in the one place they wouldn't bother to search: the forgotten private sanctuary of Pier 73. The Coast Guard's official closure wasn't an oversight. It was the intended outcome of Owen's final act. Callahan's dismissal, however, felt like a direct warning. Stop digging. The true emotional barrier, however, was still ahead. Anya knew she couldn't rely on official records. She needed the human story, the pain, the lingering doubt. She needed Coral Blackwood. Locating the daughter had been surprisingly easy. Coral, now in her mid-20s, ran a small, struggling marine supply store, the Anchor's Edge, a few blocks from the main waterfront, deliberately distanced from the fishing action and the painful sight of the working fleet. Anya found Coral behind the counter, a figure of striking, contained intensity. Her hair was indeed the turbulent, fiery red described in the old photograph, but her eyes, the deep color of the open ocean, held a fierce, hardened bitterness. She wasn't just grieving, she was guarding a wound. "Can I help you?" Coral asked, her voice clipped, devoid of the warmth common in small-town retail. She was strong, singular, and intimidating, the complete opposite of Anya's own quiet vulnerability. "Coral Blackwood?" Anya began tentatively, holding the small, square photograph of the 9-year-old girl in her pocket for emotional courage. "My name is Anya Sterling. I recently bought your father's old shack, the one on Pier 73. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Coral's composure shattered, replaced by a raw, cold fury that made Anya instinctively take a step back. Coral slapped her hand on the counter, the sound sharp and demanding. "You what?" Coral's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a breaking storm. "You bought that ruin? Who in God's name are you to walk into his memory, that sacred rotten place? Did old man Finn sell you the lies too, the one about the treasure map?" Her eyes were burning holes through Anya. "You think you're going to find something romantic? You think you know my father?" Anya tried to explain, to offer an apology, but Coral cut her off with venomous speed. "My father was not some pirate in a novel, Miss Sterling. He was a brilliant man, a navigator, a scientist. And he didn't just fall off his boat. He was searching for something real, something that mattered, and the sea took him because he was too good, too far ahead." The intensity of her belief was shocking. The Coast Guard lied to cover up their ineptitude. The town wanted a folk story. But I know the truth, he was looking for a pattern, an anomaly. And he left me behind to clean up the mess and deal with the whispers. Coral leaned over the counter, her face pale with residual pain. The only thing that shack held was his loneliness and his obsession. And if you think tearing down those walls is going to make you rich, you're wrong. You're just desecrating the last place he was truly himself. Anya realized then that Coral did not believe her father was lost. She believed he was betrayed either by the sea, by the authorities, or by the magnitude of his own quest. But she was mourning the man, not the mystery. Anya slowly withdrew the photograph from her pocket, sliding the fragile, faded image across the counter. Coral's eyes fell on the picture of the smiling girl holding the drawing of the North Star. The image hit her like a physical blow. The fury drained away, replaced by an agonizing, fragile vulnerability. A single hot tear traced a path through the bitterness on her cheek. "He called you his North Star," Anya whispered, finding an unexpected reservoir of strength and empathy. He buried this photo, his wedding ring, and a dried flower beneath the floorboards of the shack, where he could walk over them every day. He didn't forget you, Coral. He made a painful, private farewell. He left an anchor for you. The sight of her childhood self, a relic from the past only Anya could have recovered, pierced Coral's defenses. The rigid barrier she had maintained for 15 years finally fractured. The bitter heart of the captain's daughter, fiercely guarding his memory, finally yielded a tiny crack of fragile hope, but it was still rooted in suspicion. "Why are you here, Miss Sterling?" Coral asked, her voice now dangerously low and thick with unshed tears. "If you found that, what else did you find? Are you here to mock me, or to finish what he started?" Anya stood firm, the compass in her pocket feeling like a shield. "I'm here because someone is watching that shack, Coral. Someone who doesn't want Owen Blackwood's peace disturbed. And I need to know what he was looking for because I think those human variables he mentioned are still out there." The exchange was a powerful emotional reset. Anya's vulnerability had been weaponized into empathy, creating a fragile bridge between the newcomer and the bereaved daughter. She had gained a volatile, unpredictable ally who held the intimate, painful context of Owen's final days. The fragile, volatile truce forged at the counter of the anchor's edge led Anya back to Pier 73, not alone, but with the weighty, intense presence of Coral Blackwood. The daughter moved through the shack, her father's sanctuary now occupied by a stranger, with a terrible reverence, her fiery red hair seeming to absorb the low light of the space. Her bitterness had momentarily been eclipsed by the shock of the hidden mementos. The photograph, the ring, the dried flower, they were proof that Owen hadn't abandoned her heart. He had simply concealed his goodbye. Coral's presence was a liability in terms of secrecy. She was known, and her reappearance at the long-abandoned Blackwood lot was sure to draw attention. But she was also Anya's only key. She understood Owen's idiosyncrasies, his particular brilliance, the way his mind connected the disparate dots of science, history, and the deep ocean. Anya spread the celestial map and the captain's logbook across the refurbished workbench. The scent of fresh varnish, mingled with the salt crust of ages, filled the small space. "He didn't want anyone to find this, Coral," Anya whispered, pointing to the meticulously coded entry from August 26. He said, "The risk is calculated, but the variables are human. And they are close. This wasn't an accident. This was a mission he knew he might not survive." Coral knelt before the map, tracing the complex geometric vectors between the constellations with a fingertip that trembled slightly. He always talked about the deep Earth clock. He believed that celestial alignments didn't just affect the tides. They influenced the magnetic fields of the Earth's crust, the deep-sea thermal vents, even the migration of life in the abyssal zone. Everyone called him crazy, but his hauls were always extraordinary. Anya pointed to the coordinates listed at the bottom of the map, followed by the archaic alchemical symbols. "These aren't standard coordinates. They point to the Cascadia Channel, a deep-sea trench far off the coast. Nothing is there but depth. But what about these symbols? Do they mean anything to you?" Coral frowned, her memory struggling against the grief. She picked up the logbook, flipping through the pages until she landed on a seemingly unrelated entry. A notation about the specific gravity of seawater and its thermal exchange properties. Suddenly her eyes widened. "I remember," she exclaimed, the realization hitting her with the force of a breaker wave. "When I was little he taught me a memory game. He'd point to the alchemical symbols. The circle for gold, aurum, the crescent for silver, argentum, the triangle for sulfur, and then he'd make me match them to elements but not the stable ones. He was obsessed with isotopes, the heavy, unstable versions of common elements found near thermal vents. He said they were proof of the deep Earth clock. The breakthrough was electrifying. The symbols weren't arbitrary code. They were a complex, private shorthand for rare earth elements and heavy isotopes, substances highly valued in advanced metallurgy, deep-sea research, and perhaps military technology. Owen wasn't just fishing. He was researching and potentially tracking something incredibly valuable and specific, something that required precise celestial navigation to locate. Anya leaned into the discovery. Then the coordinates aren't just a place, they're a sequence. A route. Each coordinate corresponds to a specific element or isotope he was tracking, likely emanating from the deep sea floor. He was compiling a map of anomalies, not just fishing spots. The truth of Owen Blackwood's disappearance snapped into chilling focus. He hadn't been lost, he had found something too valuable or too sensitive. His obsession with the stars was the key to an earthly treasure, or a dangerous secret, that others wanted to control. The human variables were no doubt people who understood the true value of what Owen had discovered and were willing to kill to keep it secret or claim it. This revelation was the point of no return. Anya was now deeply embroiled in corporate or possibly governmental espionage, a terrifying realization for the vulnerable woman who just wanted to mend nets. Her past fear of financial failure was dwarfed by the fear of being hunted. As they spoke, a low, unnerving sound began to permeate the old wood of the shack, a slight rhythmic creaking distinct from the natural groans of the pier. Coral, raised on the docks, heard it first. She grabbed Anya's arm, her eyes wide with a sudden, primal alarm. "That's not the wind," Coral whispered fiercely, pulling Anya toward the back wall. "That's weight. Someone is under the shack on the pilings." The pier foundation was built on huge, century-old cedar pilings, leaving a dark, inaccessible space beneath the floorboards, open to the lapping tides. The creaking meant someone was actively moving, possibly waiting or, worse, using a small, silent boat beneath the structure to listen or observe. "They're searching Anya," Coral hissed, her face pale. "They think we're stupid. They think we won't notice." The recent threat from the stranger now felt immediate and suffocating. Anya's mind, disciplined by years of managing crises, snapped into pure action. She grabbed the logbook and the map, thrusting them into Coral's hands. "You need to leave. No. Take these. Go out the back, there's a gap in the fence near the abandoned winch. Go to the furthest point away from the main road. But go." Anya's command was sharp, authoritative, a tone Coral hadn't expected from the seemingly fragile newcomer. The hero was shedding her shell. "I'll give you 10 minutes. If they hear you, they'll know you have the documents. Hide them. I'll stay here and I'll make noise. I'll be the distraction." Coral, momentarily stunned but understanding the gravity of the situation, nodded once, her grip tightening on the relics of her father. She slid out the back door, melting into the thick, protective fog and the maze of abandoned storage containers, taking the undeniable proof of Owen's mission with her. Anya waited a single terrifying minute, counting the seconds, the sound of the creaking beneath the floorboards growing marginally louder. Then she moved. She grabbed the heaviest object she could find, a coil of thick, greasy rope weighty with salt and use, and deliberately threw it against the furthest wall with a deafening thwack. "Hello," Anya yelled, injecting a strained, artificial panic into her voice. "Who's there?" "I'm calling the police." The creaking stopped instantly. Silence returned, heavy and menacing. Anya stood perfectly still, waiting for the consequence of her challenge. She had just drawn a line in the salt-crusted sand, confirming to the human variables that the Blackwood lot was not empty, and that the new owner was now a player in Owen Blackwood's dangerous game. The fragile girl was gone, the protector remained. The silence that followed Anya's panicked shout was more terrifying than any sound. It was the calculated stillness of a predator that knows its prey is trapped. Beneath the floorboards of Pier 73, the creaking had ceased entirely, confirming that the intruder had gone still, assessing the distraction. Anya stood absolutely rigid near the front door, the darkness of the shack a thin shield. Her heart pounded a frantic drumbeat against her ribs, but her mind, surprisingly, was clear, focused purely on the 10 minutes she had bought Coral. She knew she couldn't risk leaving the door and she couldn't call the police, not only because the intruder might react violently before help arrived, but because Chief Callahan had already made it clear the Coast Guard considered the Blackwood file closed. In Astoria, the law was often guided by silence. Anya edged toward the workbench, grabbing the heavy, rusty crowbar she had used to pry open the secret panel. It was an inadequate weapon, but holding its cold, coarse steel offered a minute anchor of courage. She listened intently, the damp air amplifying every sound, the whisper of the fog, the distant, mournful cry of a seabird, and the slight, irregular drip-drip-drip of the high tide against the pilings below. Then the true nature of the confrontation was revealed. It wasn't a climb through the floorboards. It was an act of brutal sabotage. A loud, splintering crack erupted from the supporting structure just beneath her feet, followed immediately by the sickening, grating groan of stressed wood. The entire shack lurched violently to the side, throwing Anya off balance and slamming her into the wall. A plume of acrid, rotten wood dust exploded around her. The intruder wasn't trying to confront her. They were trying to sink the evidence. They were sawing or breaking the pilings, aiming to collapse the structure into the rising tide, drowning the star map and the logbook along with its unsuspecting custodian. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her, but the memory of the menacing voice and Owen's cryptic final words, "The variables are human," hardened her resolve. She was no longer running from debt. She was fighting for the memory of a man and the life of his daughter. The door to the shack burst open with a crash, splintering the frame. Standing silhouetted against the diffused yellow glow of the dock lights was a large, powerfully built figure. He wore dark, heavy oilskins and a hood pulled low over his face, obscuring his features but emphasizing the sheer bulk of his frame. He moved with the practiced, heavy gait of a man accustomed to the violent roll of a fishing deck. "Where is it?" the man demanded, his voice muffled by the fog and the heavy fabric, but it was the same low, flat voice that had warned her 2 nights ago. "The captain's papers. You won't leave here with them." Anya, adrenaline surging, knew negotiation was useless. She threw the crowbar with all her strength toward the man's legs, but the distance was too great, and the heavy material of his gear absorbed the blow with a dull thud. The man stepped inside, the floor creaking alarmingly under his weight. He scanned the small, illuminated room, his eyes instantly falling on the recently cleaned workbench. He didn't see a desk. He saw the place where the celestial map must have rested. Anya used the precious seconds he was distracted to bolt toward the back door. The path Coral had taken. She scrambled through the broken frame, hitting the wet, slick planks of the private section of the pier hard. The air was colder here, thicker with fog, offering precious, temporary cover. She heard the man's heavy footsteps behind her, gaining quickly. He was faster, stronger, and knew the terrain. He had chased men across pitching decks. A terrified young woman on a flat pier was no challenge. "Stop!" he roared, the sound cutting through the fog. "You won't escape the tide." Anya reached the sagging chain-link fence, the one defining the perimeter of the Blackwood lot. She ripped through the broken section Coral had used, the rusted metal tearing painfully at her coat, ignoring the sting. She sprinted toward the abandoned winch near the edge of the water, the landmark Coral had been told to follow. Just as she reached the massive, stationary metal drum, her foot snagged on a stray coil of heavy, discarded cable. She tumbled forward, crashing hard onto the planks, the wind knocked from her lungs. The man was upon her immediately. A heavy, gloved hand clamped onto the back of her jacket, yanking her violently backward, dragging her across the splintered wood. "The papers!" he snarled, shaking her roughly. "Where did you hide Blackwood's final route?" I don't have them." Anya gasped, struggling against his immense grip. A true moment of raw vulnerability facing overwhelming power. The man raised his other hand not to strike but to subdue her, when a sudden blinding flash of light erupted from the darkness of the surrounding storage containers, accompanied by a deafening metallic crash. Coral Blackwood had returned. She hadn't run far, she had waited and planned. Using her knowledge of the neglected dock, Coral had overturned a stack of discarded empty fuel barrels and aimed the light of a powerful ship's lantern directly into the face of Anya's assailant. The resulting noise and sudden illumination caused the man to flinch instinctively, his grip on Anya momentarily loosening. "Leave her alone," Coral screamed, her voice a desperate, terrifying mix of grief and vengeance. "You want his secrets? You should have let him go." Anya didn't hesitate. Seizing the tiny sliver of opportunity, she twisted out of his slackened grasp, scrambling away. She grabbed the edge of the pier, using the last of her adrenaline-fueled strength to roll away from the man and into the deeper shadow near the water. The attacker, momentarily disoriented by the harsh light and the surprise attack, roared in frustration. He turned his attention toward the new threat, taking 2 menacing steps toward Coral. "You're making a mistake, girl," he warned. "No," Coral retorted, her voice shaking but steady. "I'm finishing my father's work." She threw the heavy lantern at the man's chest, momentarily staggering him. Anya, now hidden in the dark, knew this was her chance to truly make the man stop. Her eyes fell on the very cable that had tripped her, a thick, rusted mooring line, still secured to the abandoned winch. With a sharp kick, she sent the coiled end flying, wrapping it around the man's ankle just as he took another step toward Coral. Anya yanked the line with all her might. The man, unbalanced by the unexpected trip, stumbled violently, his full weight crashing heavily onto the dock. His head struck the rough wood with a sickening, audible thud. He lay still, his massive frame sprawled across the planks, the heavy oilskins barely moving. For a terrifying, endless second, only the fog and the drip of the tide occupied the world. Anya slowly crawled out of the shadows, breathing hard, the metallic taste of panic replaced by the dizzying rush of triumph and profound fear. They had stopped him. The vulnerable woman and the grieving daughter, united by a desperate act of courage, had fought off the human variable. Coral ran to Anya, pulling her up with a strength born of pure adrenaline. "We have to go. He'll be up soon." But Anya, bleeding from the rough ordeal and leaning heavily on Coral, looked back at the collapsed man. "He won't be," she whispered, her gaze hard. "He was searching for a final route. We need to know what he knows. We have to search him, Coral. No. Before the tide rises and takes the shack completely." The confrontation solidified their alliance not in words, but in blood and shared risk. Anya had faced the enemy head-on and survived, shedding the last vestiges of her victimhood. They were now bound to the mystery, jointly responsible for the truth, and they had just captured the first living link to Owen Blackwood's fate. The fallen man lay motionless on the rough planks, a heavy, silent burden draped across the dock. The sharp, sickening impact of his head against the wood had bought Anya and Coral precious, necessary time. The adrenaline that had propelled Anya was now ebbing, replaced by a profound, shaking fatigue and the cold horror of what they had done. She was a woman who had run from financial ruin, not one who engaged in violence. But her fear was now overshadowed by a chilling determination. "We need to move him," Anya whispered, her voice strained, leaning heavily on the dilapidated winch. "If he wakes up, we're finished. If anyone sees him, we're arrested. We can't call the police." Coral, though equally shaken, possessed a hardened pragmatism born of a lifetime around the unforgiving commerce of the docks. "He's too heavy for us to drag far. We take him inside the shack, secure him and keep watch. If he's conscious, he knows where the star map is not. If he's unconscious, we take what he has." They worked in a strained, silent choreography, moving the massive figure with desperate effort, pulling him onto a canvas tarp and sliding him across the pier floor and into the relative security of the damaged Blackwood lot. The wooden pilings groaned ominously. The shack was already listing dangerously, confirmation of the man's sabotage. Inside, under the harsh glare of the work lamp, the man's features, previously obscured by the hood, were finally revealed. He was middle-aged with the weathered, calloused look of a seasoned fisherman, but his eyes, now closed, held a perpetual scowl, etched by resentment or chronic anger. He was not a hired thug, he was a working man, one of the community. Anya knelt, her hands surprisingly steady. The first thing she found, clipped to the inside pocket of his oilskins, was a simple Astoria dock worker's identification card. The name beneath the faded photo was Gus Peterson, and he was registered as a former deckhand on a long-haul crabbing vessel. Anya remembered the name from Finn's rambling. Gus had been a vocal skeptic of Owen Blackwood's scientific nonsense, a captain who stuck to tradition. Peterson, Coral spat, her voice tight with recognition and fury. "He used to dock 2 piers down. Always envied my father's catches. Always called him a dreamer." But Gus Peterson's resentment alone couldn't explain the attempted murder and the highly specific knowledge of Owen's secret. There had to be a deeper connection. Anya methodically searched the rest of his gear. In a waterproof inner pouch, she found a recent high-resolution satellite photograph. It was a clear aerial shot of a remote, small and rarely visited island off the Canadian coast, the kind of place where nothing but seals and mist prevailed. The photograph had 2 distinct features circled in sharp red ink: a small, sheltered cove and a tiny, almost invisible structure built into the dense tree line. The coordinates of this island were written beneath the photo, and they were chillingly familiar. They matched the final, most complex coordinates on Owen's celestial map. He was going after him, Anya breathed, holding the proof of a long-term, calculated pursuit. Owen didn't just disappear. He went somewhere, and Gus Peterson was tracking him, using the same destination. Coral stared at the photo, the implication vast and shattering. He's been waiting 15 years? Why? What did my father find that was worth this kind of risk? The answer came not from the still unconscious Gus, but from a small, coded receipt tucked into his wallet. It was a receipt for a massive, specialized marine battery and a deep-sea submersible beacon, purchased 6 months ago from a discreet commercial marine supplier, not in Astoria but in Seattle. The purchase was registered under a shell company, but the date was recent and the equipment was highly specialized. Gus hadn't been searching for Owen for 15 years. He had been activated recently, armed with the final piece of the puzzle. They realized the terrifying truth. Owen Blackwood had successfully reached his destination. He had survived the crossing. He was on that remote island and Gus Peterson was on his way to find him, not to rescue him but to steal his discovery. Owen's disappearance was not the end of the mystery. It was the beginning of his vigil. The revelation was a profound emotional reset for both women. For Coral, the bitter grief that her father was a failure, a fool who fell overboard, dissolved entirely. Her father was a pioneer, a survivor, a man living out his destiny. For Anya, the mission transformed from investigating a cold case to saving a life. Suddenly, Gus stirred, a ragged groan escaping his lips. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes clouded with pain and deep-seated malice. He focused on Anya, the delicate woman with the pale hands, and a look of cold, predatory triumph crossed his face, despite his obvious pain. Too late, Gus slurred, his voice thick and labored. The North Star didn't sink. But yours will. I already cut the main support. He laughed, a dry, grating sound. And he's not on that rock, girl. He's been gone for months. I just came for the map. And now I have the location of the next one. The words struck Anya and Coral like a physical blow. He's been gone for months. Owen Blackwood hadn't been waiting 15 years. He had simply passed through the island. And the next one? Gus's sudden movement sent a fresh wave of agony through his head. He gasped, falling silent again, but not before delivering the final, crucial piece of information. There are others. You're just wasting time. The shack groaned again, louder this time, a long, tearing sound of wood giving way under pressure. The structure was rapidly approaching collapse. They had minutes, perhaps less. Gus's final, mocking words had shattered the illusion of a simple confrontation. They weren't fighting one man. They were fighting an organization. And the truth, like the tide, was rising fast. The floor of the Blackwood lot gave one final, gut-wrenching shriek of protest. A heavy support beam snapped with the sound of a pistol shot, and the shack pitched sharply, sending Gus Peterson, still semi-conscious, sliding into the wall. The tide, rising rapidly and now assaulting the freshly severed pilings, sloshed audibly beneath their feet. Time had run out. The sanctuary was collapsing, and they had to abandon the only place that held the key to Owen Blackwood's survival. We have to go now. Coral yelled, grabbing Anya's arm. Her initial rage had settled into a steely, focused survival instinct. Anya, however, couldn't leave empty-handed. She snatched the satellite photo from the unconscious Gus, the image of the remote Canadian island, and shoved it into the newly restored, deep interior pocket of her jacket, a place where no one would think to look. The coordinates of Owen's apparent refuge were now hers, the next waypoint on a journey she never asked to take. They scrambled out of the shack just as the roof began to buckle inward. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. The heavy, echoing crash confirmed the final, watery demise of Pier 73. The secrets of Owen Blackwood were now truly submerged, buried under the rising tide and the weight of the collapsed structure. The urgency was now absolute. They couldn't go to the police. Gus Peterson would be found in the wreckage and they would be implicated in the assault regardless of the truth. Their only option was to follow Owen's trail immediately before Gus's others could catch up. They retreated to Coral's marine supply store, the Anchor's Edge. The store, ironically, was the perfect base. It was quiet, had navigation charts, fuel, and a small, powerful fishing vessel tied up at its private slip, Coral's late mother's boat, the Not Too Fast. Inside the store's dim, lamplit office, the star map and the logbook were spread out, heavy with the weight of consequence. Anya pointed to the coordinates on the satellite photo of the island. This is the location of the final coded coordinate on the star map, Anya explained, her finger tracing the lines. But Gus said Owen left months ago. And he mentioned a next one. Coral's eyes scanned the complex celestial chart, now seeing her father's work not as madness, but as a brilliant, sequential logic. The star map isn't static, Anya. It's a clock. Look at the orbital positions he marked here and here. She pointed to the circled constellations corresponding to two sequential isotopes. He didn't just find one anomaly, he found a route of anomalies. The isotopes he was tracking are released periodically, likely connected to deep-sea seismic activity influenced by these alignments. If the island was the last known point, we have to find the first point, the origin of his journey 15 years ago. They pored over the logbook, cross-referencing the first entry with the star map's earliest coordinates. The first sequence on Owen's map pointed to a location known only by specialized seismic researchers. The Juan de Fuca Ridge, an active tectonic spreading center far out in international waters, a place of intense thermal venting and deep-sea life. This was the true North Star of Owen Blackwood's scientific quest. He used the island as a temporary base, a safe harbor between discoveries, Anya concluded, a new sense of mission overriding her fear. He was tracking these elements, building a catalog. The final destination on the star map, the island, was only the last place he intended to be before he vanished. No, Coral corrected, her eyes blazing with fierce clarity. The final destination on the star map is the island. But look at the logbook's final coded entry. Coral pointed to the very last page where Owen had scrawled a single cryptic note beneath the date of his disappearance. Project complete. Return to the original source. The clock runs down. X. 47.33 N. 124.61 W. The coordinates were familiar. They were not some remote ocean trench. They pointed to a location startlingly close. The tumultuous, notoriously dangerous waters off Cape Disappointment, near the mouth of the Columbia River. The very waters Owen Blackwood had sailed from, and the area where his boat had eventually been found adrift. The original source, Anya whispered, the cold reality sinking in. He didn't just research the deep sea. He brought his discovery home. He returned to the area of his departure. And the coordinates, Coral continued, her voice heavy with realization. That's exactly where the North Star was found adrift. He sailed to the island, executed his plan, then returned to this specific spot and set his boat on a drift course. The submerged truth began to reveal itself. Owen Blackwood had used the star map to track and secure his valuable discovery. He had returned to the spot of his death, to plant the final piece of evidence, betting that the ensuing search for his body would keep the Coast Guard occupied while the real secret lay hidden, dormant at the bottom of the sea. But why risk this return? Why not simply sail away? Anya realized the logic of the vulnerable man. He didn't trust anyone. Not the Coast Guard, not his competitors. He didn't want the secret found or stolen. He sunk it right where everyone believed he died. It was a perfect burial meant to be found only by the person who could break his code. You. Coral's breath hitched. He came back to the one place everyone would stop searching, and he left his biggest secret under their noses. But if Gus Peterson had the island's coordinates, the others must be close to the origin now. The mission became instantly clear. They had to sail to the location of the North Star's recovery, the coordinates X, 47.33 N, 124.61 W, and find whatever Owen had hidden there before Gus's partners could. Anya, the fragile woman who had sought refuge in Astoria, looked at Coral, the grieving daughter who now carried the flame of her father's legacy. We have the map, the motivation, and the final coordinates. The not too fast is ready. But we can't go without a plan. We need to know exactly what we are looking for. Coral walked to a dusty, forgotten corner of the store and pulled out a heavy, canvas-wrapped roll of charts. The kind of specialized bathymetric maps used by surveyors, not fishermen. He always told me, if you want to know what's at the bottom of the sea, you don't ask a sailor, you ask the dirt. We look for an anomaly in the seafloor structure, an object that shouldn't be there. As the sounds of the collapsing shack faded into the distance and the scent of diesel filled the air, Anya and Coral prepared to face the unforgiving Pacific. Their alliance, born of a rusty compass and a secret wall, was about to be tested by the turbulent, deadly waters of Cape Disappointment. The Not Too Fast, a 30-foot trawler built for endurance rather than speed, cut a steady, determined path through the restless waters off Cape Disappointment. The area, known ominously as the Graveyard of the Pacific, lived up to its name, demanding respect from the sea-worn coral, who navigated the swirling confluence of the Columbia River and the Pacific Ocean. Anya, clinging to the rail, felt the raw, brutal power of the sea, a profound contrast to the quiet intellectual mystery of the celestial map now tucked safely in a waterproof bag. They reached the final coordinates, X, $47.33 N, E 124.61 W $, the exact spot where the North Star had been found adrift 15 years prior. The water here was dark, turbulent, and mercilessly deep. Coral, utilizing the specialized bathymetric charts, identified an anomaly, a small, dense echo on the seafloor, inconsistent with the natural sediment and rock. It was small, metallic, and deep, precisely what an exacting man like Owen Blackwood would sink to ensure secrecy. Anya knew they couldn't retrieve it. The human variables, Gus Peterson's partners, were the true threat, and Gus's frantic attempt to sink the cabana confirmed their urgency. As if on cue, a large, modern trawler, the Deep Current, suddenly materialized out of the fog, bearing down on them with alarming speed. It wasn't fishing, it was hunting. They found the coordinates, Coral hissed, spinning the wheel to avoid the wake. They must have followed Gus's transmission logs after we took him down. Anya, gripping the bearing compass, made a split-second, impossible decision. We don't need to retrieve it, Coral. We just need to expose it. She grabbed the not-too-fast radio microphone. Knowing the Coast Guard monitored all marine channels in the Graveyard of the Pacific, she made her desperate final broadcast. Mayday, Mayday. This is the not-too-fast, at coordinates $47.33 N, 124.61 W $. We are observing illegal dredging near a known U.S. Navy testing site. The vessel, Deep Current, is attempting to recover a dangerous, classified object at this location. Request immediate intervention and full salvage operation. Repeat, classified object in recovery. It was a brilliant fabrication, a desperate lie built on the foundation of Owen's complex truth. By claiming the object was classified and threatening a Navy testing site, Anya ensured the Coast Guard wouldn't just send a patrol. They would send a full, non-negotiable retrieval team, forcing the secret into the hands of the authorities and out of the hands of Owen's adversaries. The Deep Current immediately recognized the gravity of Anya's broadcast. They aborted their approach, the large trawler turning sharply, vanishing into the fog with the haste of guilt. They knew that facing the authorities over an alleged classified object was a losing battle. The reward was now poisoned. 10 minutes later, the unmistakable drone of a Coast Guard helicopter confirmed Anya's gambit. The chase was over. Owen Blackwood's buried secret was finally, publicly exposed. Anya and Coral watched from a respectful distance as the Coast Guard and a specialized salvage vessel arrived. The mission was complete. They had protected Owen's legacy and ensured his discovery would not fall into the hands of criminals. The aftermath and redefined purpose. A week later, the storm of media coverage and official investigation finally began to subside. The salvaged object was a pressure-sealed, highly specialized deep-sea module containing seismic data recorders and core samples. Irrefutable proof of Owen Blackwood's 15-year scientific journey tracking rare earth isotope anomalies along the deep-sea fault lines. His work was not a treasure hunt, but a genuine, groundbreaking scientific catalog, vital for global seismic prediction and resource mapping. He was 15 years ahead of his time. The human variables were likely a resource cartel attempting to steal the data before it could be formalized. Chief Callahan, his face a complex mask of apology and professional pride, found Anya at a newly resighting Pier 73. The Coast Guard has officially revised Case File 457, he admitted, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Captain Owen Blackwood is no longer considered a victim of a marine accident. He is recognized as a dedicated researcher who went to extraordinary lengths to protect his findings. We're opening an investigation into the Deep Current and its ownership. The news provided Coral with the ultimate emotional resolution. Her father wasn't just a legend, he was a hero. The shame and the bitterness of the unconcluded grief dissolved, replaced by a fierce, dignified pride. She reopened the anchor's edge with a renewed focus, now using the store as a platform to honor her father's scientific vision, selling specialty charts and promoting marine research. Anya, meanwhile, was back at the reconstructed Pier 73. The Blackwood lot was gone, but in its place stood a sturdy, rebuilt structure, her new home. The community, who had initially seen her as a fragile interloper, now regarded her with a grudging, profound respect. She wasn't just the woman who restored a shack. She was the woman who finished a hero's mission. She hadn't found financial wealth, but she had found something infinitely more valuable: purpose. Her hands, no longer trembling with anxiety over debt, now worked confidently, fixing lines and mending nets. The compass, OB, sat proudly on her workbench. Coral visited one final time, bringing a gift: a beautifully framed print of the star map, the celestial geometry now perfectly clear. "You saved him, Anya," Coral said, her eyes, once hard, now soft with gratitude. "You were the one person who wasn't afraid to look up. My father left the anchor here, but you were the one who pulled it up." Anya smiled, looking at the map. "You gave me a life, Coral. I came here running from failure. I found a way to use my fear and my skills to fight for something real. The tide took Owen's body, but it brought his truth, and it brought me a home." Anya Sterling, the vulnerable refugee from the Midwest, had completed her hero's journey. She had faced the sea and the shadows, and in finishing the mission of a forgotten captain, she had finally built the life, strong, singular, and anchored, she had come to Astoria to find. The restoration was complete, not of a shack but of a legacy and of herself.